It was one of those nights when the weight of life felt too much to bear. I'd been struggling to make ends meet for months, temp jobs, odd shifts, and the looming dread of bills I couldn't pay. Every day was the same. Wake up, search for work, hope for something, anything to come through. And then, on a particularly desperate evening, I saw the ad. Night guard needed at the Historical Museum. Great pay, experience preferred. Apply now. The words felt like a lifeline. I didn't care about the specifics. I was willing to take anything, no matter how strange the hours, as long as it meant I could stop worrying about rent for a little while. So, I picked up the phone and called the number. The voice on the other end was cold, yet strangely inviting. "This is Clara, the director of the Historical Museum. You're inquiring about the night guard position?" "Yes," I said, trying to sound as composed as possible. "I saw the ad and would love to apply." She paused for a moment before responding. "We're looking for someone reliable, someone who can handle long hours. There are some peculiarities with this job, though. It's not for everyone." Her words hung in the air like a warning, but at that moment I was too desperate to care. "I'm fine with peculiarities. I just need work." "All right," she said, a slight tension in her voice. "I'll schedule an interview. Come by tomorrow and we'll talk." The next day, I arrived at the museum, a grand old building that had seen better days. It was located at the edge of town, far from the hustle and bustle of the busy streets. The place had an almost otherworldly feel to it, like it didn't quite belong to the present. The towering stone columns, the faded carvings in the brickwork, the dim lights casting long shadows, it was as though the museum had been untouched by time. Inside, it smelled of old paper and dust. There were artifacts displayed in glass cases, ancient paintings hanging on the walls, and statues that seemed to watch your every move. The eerie quietness of the place was palpable, but there was something else too, a sense of heaviness, of weight, as if the museum was more than just a building. It was a keeper of secrets, perhaps. Clara greeted me at the entrance. She was a tall woman with sharp features and piercing eyes, her movements precise and deliberate. There was something unsettling about her presence, like she was more of a sentinel than a director. "Welcome," she said with a forced smile. "Let's head to my office. We can discuss the position in detail." Her office was located at the back of the museum, behind a set of heavy oak doors. The room was dimly lit, filled with books and papers stacked high on every surface. There was no warmth to the space, just cold efficiency. Clara sat behind a large wooden desk and gestured for me to take a seat. "You've probably noticed that this museum isn't like most places," she began, her voice smooth but carrying an edge. "We house some rare items, and we need someone who can keep an eye on things during the night. There are a lot of valuable artifacts, and we've had a few incidents over the years." I nodded, trying to maintain composure. Incidents? The idea of working in a museum with valuable items didn't seem too strange. I'd heard about the occasional museum theft or mishap, but there was something in her tone that suggested there was more she wasn't saying. Clara continued. "This job involves security rounds during the night, checking the exhibits, making sure everything is where it should be. You'll be working alone, which is why we need someone reliable. The museum can feel quiet after hours, and sometimes things can get a bit unsettling." "Unsettling?" I tried to brush off the comment. This was just a part-time gig, right? The pay was good, and I needed the money. I could handle a little strangeness if it meant I didn't have to worry about bills for a while. "I'm confident I can handle the job," I said, trying to sound reassuring. I'm used to working alone." Clara didn't respond immediately. She sat still, studying me with a gaze that felt far too perceptive, like she could see through every word I said. Finally, she spoke. "Good. Just remember this. The museum is more than just a collection of artifacts. The things inside these walls have histories. Some are ancient, and not all of them are as benign as they appear. You'll encounter things here that you won't understand. Be mindful of that." I nodded again, but this time I felt a slight chill crawl up my spine. Her warning was cryptic, but there was no turning back now. I needed the job, and she wasn't asking for anything unreasonable. What could be so unusual about keeping an eye on a museum at night? "We've had a few night guards over the years," Clara continued, her voice now lower, "but most of them didn't last. They left for various reasons." She paused, letting her words linger. "You seem like the type who can handle it, though. Just remember the rules." "Of course," I said, eager to move past the weird tension hanging in the air. She handed me a set of keys, a security badge, and a thick stack of paperwork. "The first shift is tonight. I'll leave you to get settled. Just don't open the restricted areas and always check the cameras. Trust me, you'll want to keep an eye on everything. Everything." Her words echoed in my mind as I left the office and walked out into the quiet museum. I tried to ignore the strange, sinking feeling in my chest. As I locked the door behind me, I could have sworn I heard something, a faint whisper, something I couldn't quite place. But there was no one else in the museum. My first night on the job at the museum felt like stepping into a different world, one that existed outside of time. The creaking wooden floors beneath my boots echoed through the empty halls as I made my rounds. It was eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of the air conditioning system and the occasional flicker of the lights. The museum, bathed in dim light, looked almost alive, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. There were so many exhibits to patrol, endless corridors filled with statues, ancient artifacts, and paintings that seemed to follow you with their eyes. I started at the main entrance, taking a long look at the Greek statues of warriors, each one standing tall with a raised sword. Their detailed features were almost too perfect, sharp, real, as though the figures could spring to life at any moment. The stillness of it all sent a shiver down my spine. The place felt like it was holding something in, some sort of energy, like it was waiting. As I moved further into the museum, I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. I told myself it was just my nerves. After all, it was my first shift, and I was walking through rooms filled with centuries-old art and statues. But as I passed the ancient Egyptian exhibit, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a flicker of movement, as though one of the statues had shifted just slightly. I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing. I glanced over at the pharaoh's statue standing stoically in the center of the room. There was no way it could have moved. These statues were heavy, immobile, created to last for thousands of years. Yet, the feeling in the air had changed. The stillness had turned unnerving. I quickly shook off the thought, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. The museum was a massive place, filled with ancient relics, and my mind was playing tricks on me. The museum was still, but not silent. It was filled with secrets, and I was there to make sure they stayed locked away. As I continued my rounds, I came to the medieval knight display. This exhibit was even more unnerving than the others. The knight's armor glinted under the dim lights, but the more I stared at it, the more it seemed as though the figure wasn't quite in the same position as before. The sword. it was angled differently than it had been during my initial inspection. I shook my head, convinced that I was just imagining it. These statues were made to look lifelike after all. But as I walked away from the exhibit, something tugged at me. A low sound, almost like scraping, coming from the far end of the hall. I paused, straining to hear. The scraping continued, growing louder, echoing off the walls. I felt my breath catch in my throat. It couldn't be. I was alone in the building, wasn't I? I turned around, walking back toward the sound, my steps cautious. The scraping was coming from the knight's exhibit. But when I arrived, the knight stood still, the sword held at the same angle. No scraping sound. I was starting to feel like a fool, trying to rationalize what was happening. The scraping had stopped as soon as I reached the exhibit. Still, the tension in the air was palpable. The museum felt different now, somehow thick with a sense of impending discovery. I walked back toward the security desk, checking my watch. It had only been a couple of hours, but the unease had already settled into my bones. The museum felt like it was alive, watching, waiting. I sat down at the desk for a moment, trying to gather myself. But before I could take another breath, a loud clang echoed through the building, followed by a distant thudding sound as if something heavy had just fallen. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling in the silence. There was no response, just the soft hum of the lights above. I moved toward the direction of the noise, every muscle in my body tensed. The sound had come from the upper level of the museum, where the ancient weaponry exhibit was housed. I reached the staircase and looked up into the dark hallway. The second floor was completely silent, except for the faint hum of the lights above. I felt like I was in some sort of nightmare, a dream where every shadow had a story and every whispering sound carried a hidden warning. As I ascended the stairs, I glanced at the security monitor. Everything seemed fine. The cameras were working, the exhibits were intact. But that scraping sound was still in my mind, pulling at me, gnawing away at my resolve. I reached the top of the stairs, carefully walking through the corridor, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The ancient weaponry room was ahead, its door ajar. I slowly pushed it open, bracing myself for what I might find. The room was dim, but something about the shadows made the space feel off. And then I saw it, the knight's sword, lying in the middle of the room, gleaming under the low light. But the knight had been in a completely different position when I last saw him. I stepped forward, my heart in my throat. Something wasn't right. Something was wrong with this place. Before I could reach out for the sword, I heard another scraping sound, closer this time. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The statues, the knights, the warriors were all moving, slowly coming to life, their eyes glinting with malice, their heavy footsteps echoing through the room. The silence was broken, and the museum was no longer a place of history. It had become a hunting ground. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat as the knight's sword clattered to the floor with a deafening clang. The scraping noise that had followed me from room to room had now escalated into something far more terrifying. I was no longer alone in the museum. The statues, the warriors, knights, and ancient heroes were slowly shifting, their stone forms coming to life. A chill ran down my spine and I backed up toward the exit, my heart hammering in my chest. The statues were moving, stepping down from their pedestals with an eerie grace that didn't belong in the world of mere stone. Their eyes, I had never noticed it before, now gleamed with life, cold and calculating. Their bodies were no longer frozen in time. They were alive, and they were looking directly at me. I grabbed the doorknob, my hand shaking violently. The door wouldn't budge. It was locked, just like all the others, but this time it felt like the museum itself had locked me in, trapping me with these animated statues. I banged on the door in desperation, trying to break free. But it was as if the entire building was holding its breath, refusing to let me escape. The scraping sound grew louder. I turned to face the statues, my flashlight beam flickering in the darkness. The knight, his sword raised, took a step forward. The ancient warrior's armor creaked as he moved, and for the first time in my life, I could feel the weight of his presence. The stone was no longer just stone. It was living, breathing, and it was hungry. Suddenly, I heard the sound of heavy footsteps coming from the hallway behind me. I whipped around to find another statue, a Greek warrior holding a spear, now walking toward me with terrifying purpose. His face was carved into an expression of rage, and the stone that had once seemed lifeless was now as real as any human being. His eyes burned with a malevolent fire. I staggered back, my mind racing to understand what was happening. It couldn't be real. Statues couldn't just come to life, but there they were, right in front of me, moving with slow deliberation, as if they had been waiting for this moment for centuries. The museum. This place I had thought of as just an old building filled with ancient artifacts was now a prison, a labyrinth where the statues were the wardens. I had to get out. I couldn't stay here. I had to find the exit. I ran, my footsteps echoing in the vast hall as I tried to outrun the sounds of scraping armor and the heavy tread of stone feet. I reached the end of the hallway and sprinted past the Egyptian exhibit, the pharaoh's gazes following me as I ran. But the sound behind me grew louder. The statues were following me, hunting me. My mind spun, but I couldn't think straight. Where could I go? The windows were locked, the doors were barred. The museum had become a maze, and I was trapped inside with creatures of stone, animated by some unknown force. My only option was to keep moving, keep running, and pray I could find a way out before they caught up to me. I reached the back hallway, the one Mr. Stroud had warned me about, the restricted section. I wasn't sure what I was hoping for, but maybe there was something back there that could explain what was happening, something that could stop these statues from coming after me. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room was dark, but my flashlight revealed a strange sight, an altar, ancient and covered in dust. Around the altar were more statues, taller, more intimidating figures. There was something different about these statues. They seemed more real, more alive than the others. The stone faces were twisted into grotesque expressions of anger and pain, and I could feel the power radiating from them. I stepped closer, and that's when I saw it, a stone tablet in the center of the altar. The markings were familiar. They were the same symbols I had seen earlier, carved into the floor of the museum. I realized with a sickening jolt that these symbols weren't just decorative. They were part of a ritual, something dark and ancient that had been happening for centuries. Before I could understand more, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, louder, closer. The statues had found me again. I turned to face the door, but it was too late. The knight and the warrior were standing there, blocking the only way out. The room had become a trap. They were closing in. There was nowhere to run. The figures moved toward me slowly, relentlessly, and I could feel the weight of their presence, the cold malice in their stone eyes. This was no accident. This was no dream. The statues were part of something far older than the museum itself. They were guardians, and I had stumbled into their world, a world where the boundaries between life and stone had blurred. Suddenly, a loud crash sounded from behind the statues, and I whipped around to find that the museum doors were now open, the light flooding in from the outside. A figure stepped into the room, and for the first time I felt a spark of hope. It was Mr. Shrugged. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. He looked at the statues, then back at me. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice trembling. "They've awakened. They were never supposed to be disturbed." The statues froze, but only for a moment. Then they shifted, moving toward us with a sudden ferocity, their weapons raised. "You're not supposed to be part of this," Mr. Shrugged whispered, backing away. "But now it's too late." The statues began to move with unnatural precision, their stone bodies creaking as they came to life, their eyes burning with an eerie glow. The once mute figures were now terrifying in their animation, their every step slow but deliberate. The knight raised his sword, the blade gleaming under the harsh fluorescent light, while the Greek warrior brandished his spear, its sharp tip aimed directly at me. The sound of stone scraping against stone filled the air, growing louder with every passing second. I looked at Mr. Shrugged, my mind racing to process what was happening. This was no nightmare. It was real. The statues were no longer mere relics of history. They had become hungry, animated by a force I didn't understand. My pulse raced, my body frozen in fear. The museum had changed from a place of history to a prison, and I was its prey. Mr. Shrugged stood there, his eyes wide with terror as he took a step back, looking at the statues that surrounded us. "You shouldn't have been here," he muttered, his voice quivering with a mixture of regret and dread. But his words didn't seem to reach me. My focus was on the statues now, on the silent march they were making toward us. The Greek warrior's spear glinted in the dim light, and I noticed, for the first time, how lifelike his expression had become. It was no longer a sculpted mask of stone. It was a living face twisted with rage and hunger, the sharp features more real than I had ever imagined. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt an icy shiver crawl down my spine. I backed away, my feet stumbling over the stone floor, unable to tear my eyes away from the oncoming figures. The knight's armor groaned as he moved, the heavy metal scraping against the floor, his body now fully animated, and with each movement, I could see the stone skin stretch and shift, as though the knight's spirit was inhabiting his once solid form. The statues were no longer just representations of history. They had come to life, each figure a living embodiment of an ancient soul. "Mr. Shrugged," I gasped, my voice a ragged whisper. "What's going on? What are they?" He barely looked at me, his eyes darting between the statues as he backed toward the entrance. "They're not statues anymore. They've been awakened. You've disturbed something ancient here, something that shouldn't have been disturbed. The curse, the magic, everything that binds them, it's broken." "Broken?" I repeated, my breath shallow. "What do you mean?" "They've been guardians," he said, his voice trembling. "Guardians of something far more powerful, something dark. These statues were never just sculptures. They were cursed, bound in stone to protect the artifact." His eyes met mine, his gaze filled with a look of deep regret. "And now they want to reclaim it." I turned back to the statues, my heart pounding in my chest as the knight moved closer, his sword held high, ready to strike. There was a terrible energy in the air, something alive and ancient, a force that pulsed with power. The statues were guardians of something greater than I could comprehend. something that had been locked away in the depths of the museum, waiting for a moment like this to break free. Without thinking, I darted toward the nearest exit, my legs carrying me faster than I thought possible, but the statues were already upon me. The Greek warrior blocked my path, his spear inches from my face. I froze, panic surging through me. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. But just as I felt my heart sink, I heard a strange cracking sound, followed by a low rumble, like the museum itself was groaning under the weight of the magic that had been awakened. I turned back to see Mr. Stroud standing at the entrance of the room, his hand outstretched as he muttered something under his breath. The statues paused. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the world had stopped. The statues stood still, their eyes still glowing, but their movements frozen in place. Mr. Stroud's face was twisted in concentration, sweat dripping from his brow. This wasn't supposed to happen, he whispered, his voice strained. The curse was never meant to break. The artifact, it's too powerful. It was meant to stay locked away. What artifact? I demanded, my voice shaking as I glanced nervously at the still-moving statues. The knight's sword seemed to shift, the stone blade now pointing downward as if it had grown impatient. The artifact, Mr. Stroud said, his eyes wild with panic, is the source of their power, the reason they've come to life. But it was hidden, locked away for centuries, until now. Now that they've awakened, they'll never stop until they've reclaimed it. I looked around, feeling the walls of the museum press in around me. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. If I didn't find a way out of this, I was going to be trapped here, like these statues, forever. The knight stepped forward again, his footsteps now purposeful, and I realized that there was only one way to escape. I had to find the artifact and destroy it before the statues could finish what they had started. "Where is it?" I asked urgently, stepping closer to Mr. Stroud. He shook his head, his face pale. "The artifact is somewhere in the museum, hidden. But the statues, they know, they can feel it." Before I could ask him more, a loud crack split the air as the knight took another step forward, and the other statues began to move once again, their eyes fixed on me. They were ready to complete their ancient task, to reclaim the artifact, no matter the cost. I didn't have much time. The knight took another step forward, his heavy armor scraping against the floor, and I could hear the deep, unsettling groan of stone as his legs shifted. The other statues, warriors, pharaohs, Greek heroes, followed suit, moving slowly, inexorably toward me. The air was thick with a strange, suffocating energy, a presence that seemed to fill every corner of the museum, watching me, waiting. I stood, frozen in place, panic clawing at my chest. The statues were no longer lifeless stone. They were predators, and I was the prey. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My legs felt like lead, and my mind was racing, desperately trying to figure out what had gone wrong, what had triggered this nightmare. And then, through the haze of fear, something Mr. Stroud had said earlier came back to me. The artifact. It was the key to all of this. The artifact was what had awoken the statues, what had unleashed this curse. But where was it? How could I stop them? The knight's sword glinted in the dim light, and I realized with a jolt of horror that they weren't just coming for me. They were protecting something. The artifact. The very object that had been hidden away in the museum for centuries. I turned to Mr. Stroud, who was still standing in the doorway, his face pale, his hand gripping the edge of the frame. He looked like he was struggling to breathe, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and regret. "You have to stop them," I shouted, desperation in my voice. "Where is it? The artifact. Where is it?" Mr. Stroud looked at me, his expression filled with an unreadable emotion. "It's hidden in the vaults beneath the museum," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But you don't understand. The artifact isn't just an object. It's alive, in a way. It's the source of the statue's power, and it's been feeding off the energy of the museum for centuries. It's what's keeping them alive." I took a step toward him, my pulse pounding in my ears. "Then we need to destroy it. We have to stop them before they... I couldn't finish the sentence. The images of the statues coming toward me, their stone forms becoming more real with every passing moment, were too much to bear. "The artifact is cursed," Mr. Stroud said, his voice shaking. "It was meant to stay hidden, locked away. We were supposed to keep it sealed in the vault, but someone broke the seal. And now the statues are awakening, and they will not stop until they reclaim the artifact." I shook my head, the gravity of the situation crashing down on me. "What are you saying? You're part of this? You knew this would happen?" Mr. Stroud's face twisted, his eyes glinting with a mixture of regret and resignation. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I was brought into it by the order that controls the museum, the one that keeps the artifact's power in check. We were tasked with guarding it, but the power is too much. The statues are connected to it. They are the guardians, but they are also prisoners. Their spirits are trapped in these stone bodies, bound to the artifact for eternity." I looked at him, my mind spinning. "So, you're saying the statues are alive, trapped in these forms because of the artifact?" "Yes," he said softly, stepping closer to me. "They are not just statues. They were once warriors, kings, gods, real beings, and their souls were bound to the stone through dark magic. But that magic is weakening. The artifact's power has begun to fade, and the statues are waking up. They want to be free, and they want the artifact." I felt a wave of nausea sweep over me. The idea of these ancient beings, these statues, being more than just stone, it was incomprehensible. And yet, as I looked around at the figures closing in on me, I could feel the malice in their gaze. They were not just figures frozen in time, they were alive, and they were hungry for something, for power, for freedom, for the artifact. "We have to stop them," I said, my voice filled with urgency. "We can't let them get to it." Mr. Stroud nodded gravely. "You're right. The artifact has to be destroyed, but it won't be easy. The vaults are deep beneath the museum, and the statues will stop at nothing to prevent anyone from getting to it." I felt my heart race as the knight took another slow step forward, his sword raised high. The statues were closing in, their movements now deliberate, calculated. I had no choice. I had to make it to the vault before they reached me, before they could reclaim the artifact and complete the curse. I turned to Mr. Stroud, my eyes wide with determination. "Where's the vault? How do I get there?" He pointed toward the farthest corner of the museum, where the floor was raised, the door hidden beneath layers of dust and stone. "You have to descend into the lower levels. But be careful," he added, his voice shaking. "The vault isn't just a room. It's a trap, designed to keep anyone from accessing the artifact. And the statues won't let you through. They'll do whatever it takes to stop you." I nodded, steeling myself for what was to come. The statues were relentless, but I had to get to that vault. I couldn't let them reclaim the artifact. It was the only way to end this nightmare. I dashed toward the back of the museum, my flashlight flickering as I moved. Behind me, I could hear the footsteps of the statues, closer now, their stone bodies creaking and groaning as they advanced. The chase had begun. I was their target, and they weren't going to stop until they caught me. My heart pounded in my chest as I sprinted down the narrow corridors of the museum, the echoes of stone feet following me, growing louder with each passing second. The statues were relentless, their movements calculated and deliberate. There was no room for escape, not from their reach, not from their ancient hunger. I had to reach the vault, the only place that could contain the artifact and, hopefully, put an end to this madness. The lights above flickered erratically as I passed through the darkened halls, the shadows dancing like watchful eyes. I barely registered the eerie silence in the air as I ran, too focused on the path ahead, the route Mr. Stroud had given me to the lower levels. The museum's labyrinthine corridors seemed endless, and every step I took felt like it brought me closer to the inevitable confrontation with the statues. The night's footsteps were growing louder, and I dared not look back. They were gaining on me, closing in faster than I could outrun. I glanced down at my watch. Time was running out. I had to find the vault before the statues reached me, before they could stop me from destroying the artifact. I rounded the final corner and saw the entrance to the lower levels ahead. The stone door was marked with ancient symbols, faintly glowing in the dim light. This was it. The vault was beneath me. The artifact, the source of everything that had gone wrong, lay somewhere inside. If I didn't get there first, the statues would reclaim it, and the curse would never be broken. I grabbed the heavy stone handle and pulled, but the door wouldn't budge. I yanked harder, panic rising in my chest. The footsteps were too close now, and I could already hear the scraping of stone on stone. The knight was almost there, his massive form looming in the darkness. With a final grunt, I pulled the door open, the heavy stone creaking in protest, and stumbled into the room. I barely had time to take a breath before the door slammed shut behind me, locking me inside. The room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the symbols carved into the walls. The air was thick, like the very atmosphere held secrets it didn't want to reveal. Ahead of me was a narrow staircase descending into the depths of the museum. My legs ached, and every breath felt like it could be my last. I had no idea what awaited me below, but I knew one thing for certain. The statues weren't far behind. I hesitated for a moment, my hand on the railing, but the noise from above snapped me back to reality. The knight was now at the door, his sword raised high. I had to keep moving. I descended the stairs, my footsteps echoing off the stone walls. With every step, the feeling of darkness grew stronger, as though I were getting closer to the heart of the curse itself. At the bottom of the stairs, I found a long, narrow hallway. The air grew colder the further I went, the light from the symbols dimming with each step I took. At the end of the hall stood a massive stone door, adorned with carvings that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. This was it, the vault, the place where the artifact had been hidden for centuries. I approached the door, my breath shallow, every muscle in my body tense with fear. The statues would be here soon, and if they reached me before I destroyed the artifact, it would be over. They would reclaim the power, and I would be trapped forever, a part of their twisted collection. I placed my hand on the door, feeling the cold stone beneath my fingertips, and pushed. It opened with a loud creak, revealing a darkened chamber within. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and upon it, a glowing stone artifact, pulsing with a light that seemed to beckon me closer. The light was faint, but it held an undeniable power, an energy that felt ancient, hungry, and alive. I stepped forward, my legs shaking beneath me. The artifact was the key to everything, the reason the statues had come to life, the reason I had been pulled into this nightmare. If I destroyed it, the statues would return to their lifeless forms. If I failed, the curse would continue and I would become just another guardian, trapped in stone for eternity. But even as I approached the pedestal, I felt a sharp sensation in my chest, like something was pulling me in, urging me to take the artifact and use its power. The air was thick, almost suffocating, as if the vault itself were alive, watching me, waiting. My mind raced. I could feel the statues growing closer, the sound of stone scraping against stone growing louder with every passing second. The choice was clear. If I didn't act now, the statues would reclaim the artifact, and there would be no stopping them. I reached for the artifact, but just as my fingers brushed against the stone, I heard the thundering footsteps of the statues above. They had found me. I was running out of time. With a surge of desperation, I grabbed the artifact and lifted it from the pedestal, feeling the power surge through me. For a moment, the world seemed to go dark, as if everything had stopped, and I felt the weight of centuries-old magic coursing through my veins. The statues were close now, and I knew that there was only one way to stop them, to destroy the artifact. With a final, desperate cry, I threw the artifact to the ground. The stone shattered with a deafening crack, the energy inside it exploding outward, filling the room with light. The statues froze in their tracks, their movements halted mid-step as the curse was broken. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the statues began to crumble, their stone forms falling to the ground, lifeless once more. The museum was still. I collapsed to my knees, breathing heavily, my body trembling with exhaustion. It was over. The curse had been lifted. But I knew something had changed. The museum was no longer just a place of history. It had become a place where the past had come alive, and I had been part of that story.